Now we can bring in John Stafford.
All right, good evening. It's nice to be here tonight. My name is John Stafford. I'm a candidate for state representative in the 37th Legislative District for position 1. Briefly on my background, I'm a 20-year resident of the district. I live on Beacon Hill. I'm a high school history teacher. I currently work for Mercer Island High School. Before that, I worked for Seattle Public Schools full-time for 15 years. I've worked in every single school virtually in Seattle schools. Prior to that, I was a management consultant for over a decade in Washington, D.C. I'm on the executive board of the 37th District Democrats and have been for 5 years. I'm a long-standing PCO, and I'm involved with 3 climate change organizations. I'm on the steering committee of the South Seattle Climate Action Network. I'm the treasurer for the Environment and Climate Caucus of the Washington State Democratic Party, and I'm a member of the 37th Legislative District Environment and Climate Caucus. I'm also the author of over 40 articles on policy for the South Seattle Emerald. Moving on to my platform briefly, I have 4 priorities. The first is to avoid austerity in the upcoming budget negotiations in Olympia. The second is to institute a new source of progressive taxation in Washington State. Third, aggressively deal with climate change. And fourth, deal with the demands for racial justice by dealing with the underlying inequities that give rise to them. Again, my name is John Stafford. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So our first question is a 3-minute question, and the question is, Washingtonians are facing unprecedented economic stress due to the pandemic. Thanks to advocates, Governor Inslee has responded by introducing an eviction moratorium and rental assistance program. These programs have helped many people, especially many AAPIs who live in the 37th District. According to research, most of the 37th District is at moderate or high risk of displacement, including many of the neighborhoods that have been traditionally home to our communities. How will you work to ensure that the legislature is protecting renters from rising rents, accumulating rents, continued economic downturns, and other concerns that impact housing stability?
Okay, thank you very much. So there's a number of vectors from which to get at this. So first, let me say there are a lot of good things happening on this front with respect to economic stability, but there more needs to be done. So let's talk about housing affordability is absolutely critical, and there's a couple different dimensions to that. First of all, we do need increased public investment in housing from the Seattle Housing Authority, King County Housing Authority, State Housing Trust Funds. So investment levels need to go up. In addition, I'm very supportive of the efforts, for example, in the International District of the interim CDA to, provide sort of culturally relevant housing. Programs like that from nonprofit groups are very, very important. So there's a housing investment dimension. It's also critical to ensure that people that are at risk, as you suggested, of losing housing are helped out so that they can actually stay in housing. That's critical. So I do support rent relief programs. I do support utility relief from Seattle City Light, Seattle Public Utilities. I support food assistance programs. All of these are critical to enabling people to stay in their residences and not become homeless in the first place. Another thing that needs to be discussed, and historically I've been opposed to the classic models of this, and that is rent control. So the model in San Francisco, the model in New York, these haven't worked well, and I actually oppose them. But there has been an interesting program established in Oregon just this last year that allows rents to rise 7.8% plus the rate of inflation each year. And that seems to conceptually strike a good balance between rent control, which is good, but also some market freedoms, which is also good. So I think we need to look at that carefully and see if there's some opportunities, an opportunity to pursue that in Washington State, if in fact that's successful in Oregon. There's a number of other important programs that are happening that I support. Washington has a shared work program, Washington State does, that enables small businesses that are struggling to pay their employees a certain percentage of their salaries and have the state pay the rest. to enable the businesses to keep operating. So I strongly support that. I think it's a great program. Another thing that Governor Inslee has recently done is establish the Washington Recovery Group. And this is a group that helps small businesses sort out the myriad different programs that are available. It's a very sort of complicated landscape of things that are available for businesses. So he's launched the Washington Recovery Group to enable businesses to sort of to get in touch with the state and figure out what mix of programs will help there. A third thing that has to happen with respect to business sustainability is tax reform. We tax businesses based on revenues, not profits. We're one of the only states in the country that does that. And that means if you're unprofitable, you still have to pay taxes. So we've known that this is a problem for a long time. Now's the time to change this so that businesses that aren't losing money, that are losing money, aren't paying taxes. So we have work to do on the affordable housing front via increased public investment. We have work to do in the homelessness area, doing everything we can to make sure people are able to stay in their housing and not become homeless. And finally, there's work to do, and a lot of it is being done, but more needs to be done to help small businesses maintain their viability, to continue to hire their employees, so that
you can move.
Moving on to a different, to more homelessness. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. So the next question is again 3 minutes. Organizations involved in the planning of this forum work with communities of all different immigration statuses, including US citizens, both US born and naturalized, permanent residents, compacts of free association, COFA, Pacific Islander residents, immigrants, refugees, and undocumented AAPIs in over 40 languages and dialects. In particular, we have also seen that Pacific Islanders are facing some of the highest rates of COVID contraction, exacerbated by higher rates of pre-existing health conditions. How will you work to ensure that COVID-19 testing, treatment, and future vaccination are available to all Washingtonians, regardless of immigration status, and that resources are available to community members who are not fluent English speakers?
Okay, thank you very much. So I have several comments on this question. First of all, this is of course critical and will become even more critical when a vaccine is discovered to make sure that there's equitable access and not access that's linked towards privilege. But let me start sort of from the top. First of all, the state needs to increase its investment in testing, contact tracing, and quarantines. So we've done a pretty good job relative to most states, but we're now seeing a resurgence of the virus that's projected to continue for several months. So the state needs to increase its investment in these areas. Second, it goes without saying, but in our era, unfortunately, it does need to be said that science needs to be held as absolutely supreme. We can't afford to have people with no scientific background offering their views as if their views are a substitute for science in formulating public policy. And we've seen even in our own state downsides associated with not fully recognizing science and the principles that it suggests. So for example, in Yakima, with a lot of farm workers, many of them on H-1B visas, we've seen significant outbreaks of COVID-19 because of a failure to follow science and the implications and policies that it suggests. So we can't be lax in any realm with respect to the recognition of the supremacy of science. And we, similar or related to that, we need to clamp down hard on super spreader events, which are having a very negative effect nationwide. A second thing that's happening is just getting started, and it's very a very positive thing, is expanded free flu shot testing, and that's happening all around the city, and in particular in South Seattle. The International Community Health Services Organization is providing services in this front. And that's going to be useful for COVID-19 on the following sort of logic, that as people get flu shots and they're inoculated against the flu, that's going to decrease the necessity for people to be going to hospitals for treatment for flu, and that's going to free up capacity to deal with the increase in COVID cases. So that's a positive thing that's happening. Third, I'll say that I am a strong supporter in universal health care, so we need to move in that direction in the short term. That would be, in my view, expanded enrollments in ACA. The state took a good step last year in implementing Cascade Care, a public option that will improve ACA enrollment levels. And in the medium term, I do support movement towards a universal single payer system. That would be best at the national level, but if it can't happen at the national level, then I do support it at the state level. I have signed the whole Washington pledge in this regard. And then perhaps the last thing I'll say is I'm strongly supportive of Jay Inslee's establishment of a $40 million fund to assist with the healthcare and economic needs of undocumented communities who obviously face huge risks now, especially under this administration, where they may have healthcare and financial concerns that that they're afraid to bring out into the open to have addressed for fear of reprisal from federal authorities. So the governor's establishment of a fund here is a very constructive way to help these communities who are at significant risk deal with these challenges. So it's a very important issue. A lot needs to be done. Some good things are happening, but more does need to happen.
Great, thank you so much. So our next question is also 3 minutes. Because of the 1996 immigrant welfare reform changes, for decades, many of our most vulnerable immigrant and refugee community members have been systematically excluded from federal benefits, and advocates have pushed the Washington state government to help fill those gaps in our social safety nets. Estimates suggest there are around 240,000 undocumented Washingtonians in our state, around a quarter of whom identify as API. The governor's office committed to establishing the Washington Immigrant Relief Fund to help provide assistance to families with undocumented members, many of which are API, and have been excluded from benefits such as unemployment and federal stimulus. Do you support the expansion of resources such as the Washington Immigrant Relief Fund and unemployment benefits for mixed status immigrant families? And what other ways would you ensure that economic relief reaches API communities regardless of immigration status?
Okay, thank you. So that's a very important question. Let me start by saying, I'll say several things again. First and foremost, we are about to engage in a budget negotiation and process in Olympia, and we are facing a $4.2 billion over about 2.5 year revenue shortfall. So the discussion, unfortunately, in some circles, is revolving around what needs to be cut. And that's the exact wrong discussion that needs to be happening. We cannot afford austerity to deal with the pending budget crisis, okay? So, and we can easily avoid that through a combination of tapping into the rainy day fund, a tax increase, which I'll talk about momentarily, and a hiring freeze. And the combination of those things will enable us to avoid an austerity approach, which would lead to a cut in benefits for disenfranchised, lower income minority communities. So that has to be avoided. And I'll say also that this was the approach that was taken in the aftermath of the 2007 to 2009 Great Recession. An austerity approach was taken. So there were cuts to TANF, there were cuts to foster care, there were cuts to affordable housing, and perhaps most notably cuts to higher education tuition funding. We now have the Washington College Grant, which is the best tuition assistance program for lower income individuals in the country. And as we move forward into the upcoming legislative session, it just needs to be the top priority to avoid an austerity approach. The austerity approach that was taken in the aftermath of the Great Recession also prolonged the length of the economic recession. As lower income people have less income to spend, that also serves as a drag on economic recovery. So it's bad for many reasons. So that needs to be addressed. I will also say we have the most progressive tax structure in the entire country. That also disproportionately impacts our lower income communities. Our lowest earning 20% of residents pay 17.8% of their income in state and local taxes, whereas our top 1% only pay 3%. So we have it exactly backwards. That means a minimum wage earner in our district pays $2,000 more in taxes each year than they would if they were in an average state. And that's a very significant amount of money. So we need tax reform. I support a capital gains tax, for example. I'm also intrigued by the Frank Chop three-pronged tax proposal, which includes a capital gains tax, a tax on high income earners, and a payroll tax. So we need to make the tax structure more progressive, and we need to raise taxes to avoid austerity. So that needs to be central. I talked before about Governor Inslee's $40 million immigration fund, which I strongly support. And then it needs to be said also that, of course, we need to remove the current federal administration, and we need to support all other such programs that support undocumented immigrant, lower income communities. I'm a supporter of DACA and Dreamers. I'm strongly supportive of a path to citizenship. Yes, these are national issues, but they need to be part of the discussion as well. So again, many things that have to happen, but our eyes need to be focused, in my opinion, on the upcoming budget negotiations in Olympia. It's critical that the appropriate philosophical approach is taken, and that's not austerity. It's a tax increase, tapping into the rainy day fund, and a state hiring freeze to avoid budget cuts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now if we could get a 1-minute closing statement.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here this evening. I've enjoyed participating in the discussion, and I appreciate the substantive nature of the questions. We face 5 crises: the public health crisis of the pandemic, the crisis of the economic recession, the crisis of the pending budget negotiations in Olympia, the demands for racial justice, and climate change, all concurrent. And it's important for us to view this as an opportunity to restructure society rather than just a task of applying a Band-Aid here and a Band-Aid here. These are very painful times, but these painful times do represent a very meaningful opportunity for us. So we need to look for ways to restructure society. My slogan of my campaign is bold structural change, not just incremental reforms. I have a high level involvement in my community. I also have a very broad background. I talked about my work in the management consulting field and as an educator and in climate change activism and with the 37th District Democrats. It will require people with a broad background to be able to make meaningful contributions to the societal restructuring that needs to happen. So I'm a substantive candidate, highly informed candidate, progressive candidate. I ask for your support. Again, my name is John Stafford, and you can learn more about my candidacy at staffordforstaterepresentative.org. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, John.